Judge Malcolm Graves sat at the bench, his gaunt hands with prominent veins resting lightly on the polished oak table, his deep-set eyes hidden behind silver-rimmed glasses that had dulled with age. For 32 years, he had wielded the gavel, forging a reputation as an unyielding pillar of justice, cold, uncompromising, unwavering. To him, the law was a sharp blade, slicing through pleas, tears, and tragic tales brought before him by defendants. He prided himself on his steadfastness, his ability to uphold principles even when his heart, in rare moments, yearned to soften. Once he had been a different man, a young, passionate lawyer who believed the law could redeem lost souls. But time and a relentless parade of cases had worn away that idealism, transforming him into a machine of judgment where emotion had no place. The courtroom today was unusually still, the air thick with anticipation, as if even the towering walls were holding their breath. Light streamed through the tall windows, casting white streaks across the gleaming marble floor, intermingling with shadows. Graves flipped through the file before him, his fingers tapping lightly on the desk in an unconscious rhythm, a habit from his days as a defense attorney. But when the courtroom doors swung open, a flicker of hesitation passed through his eyes, a brief blink unnoticed by all but himself. Something in the air stirred, a premonition he couldn't quite grasp. Celeste Navarro stepped inside, her high heels clicking softly against the marble, the sound echoing in the hushed space like a drumbeat signaling her arrival. Her dark suit hugged her frame, accentuating her slender yet resolute figure, a warrior hardened by countless battles. Her sun-weathered skin, a testament to long days spent advocating in the streets, stood out under the courtroom's harsh white lights, a silent declaration of her identity. Her black hair was tied back neatly, though a few strands framed her face, unable to obscure the sharp, unflinching eyes that met the room head-on. She wasn't an ordinary defendant. She was a brilliant attorney, a champion of justice who had fought to protect the powerless from towering giants of power. Yet today, she stood on the opposite side, facing rows of skeptical gazes, her presence a quiet storm in a sea of doubt. The courtroom buzzed. Whispers rippled through the crowd like waves, some barely concealing their disdain with smirks or sidelong glances. A young woman of color daring to challenge the judicial system? To them, her talent or intellect didn't matter. They saw only what they wanted, an outsider, someone who didn't belong. A middle-aged man in a faded shirt at the front row shook his head, muttering to his neighbor, "Who does she think she is?" A woman nearby, her hands clasped tightly, stared at Celeste with a mix of suspicion and fear, as if her very existence threatened the order they knew. But Celeste paid them no mind. She'd grown accustomed to such looks long ago, back in the impoverished outskirts of Beta City, where she'd been raised amid sneers, slammed doors, and prejudices rooted deep like weeds in the earth. It began on a late night, when Beta City sank into a rare stillness after a day of clamor and heat. The long streets lay empty, save for the hazy glow of streetlights reflecting off the wet asphalt, slick from an afternoon of drizzle. Tiny droplets clung to the leaves of roadside trees, glinting like pearls under the artificial light. A cold breeze swept through, carrying the scent of damp earth and the rustle of old poplar branches swaying as if whispering the city's untold stories, a place of gleaming facades and hidden shadows. Celeste drove home, her hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, her steady breaths forming faint wisps of vapor in the chilly car interior. Her aging Toyota, a gift from her father when she graduated college, groaned faintly with each press of the accelerator, but it remained a loyal companion through her hectic years. She had just closed a grueling case that had stretched over weeks, a lawsuit against Horizon Timber, a corporate behemoth that exploited hundreds of undocumented immigrant workers. Those laborers with calloused hands and desperate eyes had turned to the Alpha Justice Center for help. Celeste had spent sleepless nights poring over documents, facing off against Horizon's high-priced legal team, and standing before the jury with a voice that never wavered, despite the pounding in her chest. Today's victory wasn't just a ruling, it was a reaffirmation of the values she held dear. Justice wasn't the privilege of the powerful, but the right of all, no matter who they were or where they came from. She switched on the radio, and a soft jazz tune flowed from the crackling speakers, the saxophone's mellow notes blending with the hum of the engine. She leaned back, letting herself unwind in this fleeting moment of peace, but the calm shattered when red and blue lights flashed in her rearview mirror. A chill crept up her spine, like a serpent slithering along her back, and her grip tightened on the wheel. There was no reason for the police to stop her. Speed? She'd kept well below the limit, the odometer never ticking past 50 kilometers per hour on this familiar stretch. Traffic lights? She'd stopped at the yellow, counting 5 seconds in her head, a habit drilled into her by her father before the green signaled her to proceed. She took a deep breath, steadying herself as she pulled over, her hands still on the wheel in a practiced, professional reflex, honed by years of tense courtroom encounters. Heavy footsteps crunched against the asphalt, the sound of leather boots scraping gravel mingling with the faint splash of lingering puddles. 2 officers, Victor Hale and Jason Rowe, approached slowly. Hale, tall and broad with a chiseled face and narrow eyes sharp as a blade, tapped her window with the end of his baton. Each knock deliberate, a subtle threat. His gaze was icy, devoid of warmth, as if sizing up prey caught in a snare. Rowe, shorter but radiating barely contained aggression, stood behind, his hand resting casually on his holster, thumb brushing the safety latch in an idle tick. Celeste lowered the window, cold air rushing in with the faint smell of motor oil from the patrol car parked behind. She kept her voice calm, the same tone she used against opposing counsel. "Is there a problem, officers?" Rowe's eyes raked over her, lingering too long on her tanned skin and neatly tied hair, as if assessing her through a lens of unhidden bias. "You ran a red light," he said, his words slow and deliberate, carrying the weight of an undisputed fact. Celeste raised an eyebrow, a small tell of her disbelief. She knew she hadn't broken the law. She'd stopped at the yellow, counting the seconds as her father had taught her, a man who'd insisted caution was the best shield in an unfair world. But she didn't argue, not yet. Instead, she asked, her tone professional and unshaken, "Do you have proof?" Hale let out a dry chuckle, a harsh sound that rasped from his throat like a cough in the night. "We don't need it," he replied, shaking his head as if her question were a childish jest. "The only witnesses here are us." His words hit her like a slap, stark and unyielding. No cameras, no bystanders, just their word against hers, and in this system, their word carried more weight, truth be damned. Rowe smirked, his tone dripping with mockery. "You like to argue, huh? Get out of the car." Celeste didn't budge. She knew her rights she'd memorized in the lecture halls of Apex Law School, and reinforced through countless cases she'd handled. "I have the right to refuse to exit my vehicle without reasonable cause," she said, her voice even but firm, like an attorney addressing a judge rather than a woman cornered on a dark road. Hale tilted his head, irritation flashing in his eyes, his lips tightening into a thin line. "You've got 2 choices," Rowe cut in, his tone hardening into an ultimatum. "Get out, or we write you up and haul you to court." Celeste nodded slowly, accepting the citation from Hale's hand. She skimmed it, a list of baseless accusations scrawled in haste, their sloppy signatures stamped at the bottom like a badge of self-appointed authority. She gave a faint smile, not signing it, and handed it back as if it were beneath her notice. "I followed the law. Go ahead and write it up if you want." She rolled up the window, the motion deliberate and final, started the engine and drove off as their frustrated glares burned into her back. In the rearview mirror, she saw them standing there, silhouettes fading under the streetlights, faces twisted with anger, fists clenched as if itching to strike the air. They had no idea who they'd just crossed. Celeste Navarro was no ordinary citizen. She was a legal prodigy who knew the law inside out, a woman who'd spent her youth fighting for those crushed by the system. And she never bowed to injustice, no matter where it came from, no matter whose face it wore. Celeste grew up in a family where justice wasn't just an idea, it was part of their blood, a legacy passed down through generations. Her father, Eduardo Navarro was a community lawyer, a wiry man with salt and pepper hair and eyes that blazed when he spoke of human rights. He'd spent his life representing the exploited for free undocumented immigrants, slaving in factories for pennies, workers fired for daring to speak up, families evicted for missing rent. He wasn't rich, didn't own tailored suits or a fancy office, but he possessed something no one could steal: an unshakable belief in justice. Her mother, Rosa, was a social movement organizer, a petite woman whose voice thundered like lightning when she rallied a crowd. She led protests, lobbied for policy changes, and united hundreds to demand rights for oppressed communities, neglected neighborhoods, underfunded schools, citizens harassed by police for their skin color alone. Celeste remembered evenings in their modest home on Beta City's outskirts, where a dim yellow lamp cast light over a scarred wooden dining table, its cracks telling the story of a family living lean. Her father sat there, drafting pleas for a worker wrongfully sacked, his hands trembling from exhaustion but never stopping. Her mother, fresh from a march, recounted facing riot police, her voice brimming with pride and fury. "We don't just fight for ourselves, Celeste," she'd said, her eyes gleaming in the dark. "We fight for those who can't stand up alone." Her ancestors' tales shaped her childhood too. Her grandmother, Isabella, a fierce woman of color, had marched in the civil rights movements of the 60s. Celeste would sit beside her on a worn armchair, listening to stories of being hosed down by police, chased by snarling dogs through shadowed alleys, yet never faltering. "They can beat us, but they can't take our will," she'd said, her wrinkled hands gripping Celeste's, passing down a strength she'd never forget. Her grandfather, a retired miner, spoke of leading strikes for better conditions, enduring beatings from company thugs. "Justice doesn't come free, Celeste," he'd rasped, his voice rough from years of coal dust. "You have to seize it." Those experiences forged Celeste into a woman of steel will and fierce faith in fairness. She chose the law as her weapon early on. At 15, she trailed her father to court, sitting silently in the back, watching him argue for the powerless, with a voice steady despite facing corporate sharks. At 18, she declared to her family she'd become a lawyer, not for money, she said, her eyes blazing like her mother's, but to change things. She graduated top of her class from Apex Law School, a prestigious institution where she faced skeptical stares from wealthy peers who doubted a girl from the slums could outshine them. But she did, earning a full scholarship and proving her worth, then joining the Alpha Justice Center in Beta City, where she became a voice for the forgotten, immigrant workers, single mothers, youths targeted by police for their skin tone. That night, after the encounter, Celeste didn't drive straight home. She pulled into an empty lot off the road, killed the engine, and sat in the dark. Her breaths were steady, but her mind churned like a storm held at bay. Light from a distant street lamp filtered through the windshield, casting faint streaks across her face, highlighting eyes narrowed in thought. She pulled out her phone, opened the voice recorder, and began recounting every detail while it was fresh. 10:47 p.m., intersection of 17th and Elm, she said, her voice low but clear, as if testifying in court. Hale tapped the window with his baton, eyes meant to intimidate. Rowe said I liked to argue when I asked for proof. They gave no valid reason to make me leave the car. She paused, inhaling deeply, the cold air filling her lungs, easing the simmering anger in her chest. This wasn't just a random stop, it was blatant abuse of power, a slap in the face of the values she and her family had lived for. She called Daniel, a trusted colleague and civil rights lawyer. The phone rang twice before he picked up, groggy but alert once she started talking. "This is the classic abuse we always warn about," he said, sighing through the line, his voice mingling with the wind whistling past her window. "They'll falsify a report to justify it, Celeste. You know that." Her nails dug into her palm, leaving red crescents. "I figured as much," she replied, her tone low but resolute. "They didn't expect me to be a lawyer, and I'm not sitting back waiting for their next move." Daniel agreed, his voice sharpening. We need evidence. Traffic cams, a witness, something to prove they're lying. Did you record anything? Celeste nodded, though he couldn't see. I got the details on audio right after, but I need more something undeniable. Her eyes glinted in the dark, reflecting the streetlight like twin sparks. She didn't just want to protect herself, she wanted to expose those who twisted justice, to stop them from hurting others who couldn't fight back. The next day, during lunch at the Alpha Justice Center, Celeste sat at her desk, a cold coffee cup beside her, its surface rippling faintly like last night's puddles. Her small office on the third floor of an aging building bore peeling beige walls, the air tinged with the scent of old paper and ink. She scrolled through local forums on her screen, fingers flying over the keyboard, eyes scanning dozens of posts, traffic gripes, sunset photos over the Beta River, rants about rising food prices. She ignored them, hunting for a clue, a thread, anything to turn the tide. After 10 minutes, she froze. A short clip, posted by an anonymous account called Beta Watcher, popped up. The video was blurry, shaky from a distant vantage, perhaps a nearby apartment window, but it showed her car, the flashing patrol lights, and Hale and Rowe's harsh treatment despite her compliance. Rowe's voice boomed through the speakers, commanding and menacing, "Get out now, or we'll take action." Her calm response echoed faintly, "I have the right to refuse without cause." The clip cut off abruptly, but its truth was irrefutable. She downloaded it, sent it to Daniel via encrypted message, her fingers trembling with a mix of excitement and rage. "We've got proof," she typed, adding, "Meet me at the office at 2. But before he could reply, her phone buzzed violently, the screen lighting up with Beta Police Department. She answered, and a cold, emotionless voice cut through. "Celeste Navarro, you're charged with resisting an officer and obstructing an investigation. We have a warrant for your arrest. Come to the station immediately and cooperate to avoid further trouble." Celeste frowned, her mind racing like a perfectly tuned engine. They'd done what she'd feared, twisted the truth to paint her as the aggressor, wielding their authority to bend the law she'd sworn to uphold. She couldn't dodge this confrontation. "I'll be there," she said, her tone as casual as if answering a trivial question. But inside, a plan took shape. She wouldn't go alone. She'd bring the truth, a weapon they hadn't anticipated. At Beta Police Station, as she pushed through the heavy glass doors, the air hit her like a wall stifling, thick with the smell of cheap disinfectant and the drone of a photocopier in the corner. Eyes turned to her, instantly curious, doubtful, contemptuous. An officer near the front desk, his uniform stained with coffee, smirked and whispered to a colleague, sparking a low chuckle. Another, clutching a cold cup, shook his head and jutted his chin toward her, as if she were a sideshow in their dull day. A woman behind the counter scanned her from head to toe, lingering on her tanned skin and plain suit, then looked away with a subtle sneer. Celeste was used to it, the judgment, the unspoken verdict that someone like her, with her background and complexion, didn't belong here except as a suspect. A young officer, his face dotted with acne, led her to an interrogation room, barking, "Sit." The space was cramped, its gray walls patchy with damp, smelling faintly of mold. A scratched metal table sat in the center, flanked by 2 stiff chairs, a large mirror dominating the back wall, a two-way pane she knew hid watchers. She sat slowly, hands resting neatly on the table, her gaze steady despite the quickened pulse in her chest, not from fear, but from the adrenaline surging through her veins. The door swung open and Hale and Rowe entered, their boots thudding against the concrete like a war drum's beat. Gone was the mockery from the night before. Now they radiated wariness, like wolves realizing their prey had claws. Hale, towering with broad shoulders, stood rigid, his narrow eyes boring into her. Rowe, smaller but fiercer, leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his glare simmering with unchecked anger. Hale slid a file across the table with a forceful shove, stopping it just before her. "Mrs. Navarro, we have every reason to believe you resisted officers and obstructed an investigation," he said, his voice flat but pressing. "Sign here to confirm your statement." Celeste picked up the file, her fingers tracing the typed lines. The details were warped with intent. She was portrayed as belligerent, non-compliant, even shouting threats when she'd never raised her voice. Her reasonable questions, "Do you have proof?" were spun into defiance and provocation. She didn't rush to argue, offering only a faint, humorless smile. "Interesting," she said, her tone calm as if dissecting a case in court, not trapped in a dingy room. "I wonder if you actually believe this report or just hope I'll cave out of fear." Hale and Rowe exchanged a glance, brief but telling of their unease. Hale's lips tightened, his fist clenching beneath the table. Rowe smirked, about to retort, but the door burst open. Another officer, tense, signaled them out. "Judge Graves is waiting," he said curtly, his voice edged with nerves. Celeste rose, smoothing her suit, and walked out with a steady stride, unshaken. The courtroom was a pressure cooker, its vast space lined with high cream walls and white pillars standing like sentinels of unassailable power. Rows of wooden benches teemed with people reporters, witnesses, curious onlookers forming a living wall of eyes and murmurs. Celeste stood before them, facing a barrage of doubtful stares, the whispers growing louder as she entered. A young woman of color, they didn't need proof. They just needed a reason to believe her guilty. A man in the middle row, clutching a folded newspaper, muttered, "She's definitely trouble, or the cops wouldn't have nabbed her." A woman in a gray sweater eyed her with fear and scorn, as if Celeste's presence rattled the stability they'd always known. Hale stood adjusting his tone, reading the charges with feigned gravity. Defendant Celeste Navarro willfully resisted officers, refused lawful orders, and obstructed an investigation. Rowe followed, his voice steady but smug. She was uncooperative, wouldn't exit her vehicle, and made inflammatory remarks showing contempt for the law. They stood tall, eyes forward, but Celeste caught Rowe's hand, trembling as he set down the file, a crack in their facade. Judge Graves sat in silence, flipping through the file, his keen eyes darting behind his glasses. He'd heard thousands of charges like these, usually ruling without a second thought. Justice to him was simple math. Evidence plus law equals verdict. But something held him back, maybe Celeste's resolute gaze, or the way she stood, not trembling or pleading, but defiant, as if she held the truth in her hands. He tapped his fingers, a relic of his days as a defense lawyer when he'd believed he could reform this system. That Malcolm Graves was long buried under decades of rulings and disillusionment. Then a voice broke his reverie. Daniel rose, tall in a gray suit, holding a tablet with quiet confidence. "Your Honor, before you rule, I request to present critical evidence," he said, his deep voice carrying across the room. He set the tablet down, pressed play. The video flashed on a large screen, the clip Celeste had found. Shaky but clear, Hale and Rowe barking orders, their threats ringing out, while Celeste sat calm, her voice reasoned. "I have the right to refuse without cause." The patrol lights flared in the dark, illuminating their strained faces, the night wind hissing through the mic. Rowe stiffened, his shoulders locking. Hale frowned, panic flickering before he masked it with a forced smirk. Daniel pressed on, his tone cutting. "We also have GPS data from Celeste's car, proving she stopped at the light at 10:46 p.m., matching their report's timeline. And if they deny it, we've requested traffic cam footage results due in 24 hours, which I'm sure will tell the truth." Celeste crossed her arms, locking eyes with the officers, unwavering. "So, am I the one who obstructed justice, or just refused to be a victim of your abuse?" Her words hung heavy, silencing the room. The murmurs stopped, skeptical looks turned puzzled, and even the smirks faded as the crowd sat up, awaiting the officer's response. Hale's fist tightened, his jaw clenching as he swallowed rage. Rowe looked away, lips pursed, avoiding her gaze. The silence stretched, broken only by Hale's sharp breaths and the rustle of Graves' papers. Graves tapped his gavel, the sharp sound a final note. "This case requires further investigation," he said, his voice low but commanding, each word a nail in the coffin of their narrative. His eyes swept over Hale and Rowe, lingering, as if peering through them, perhaps recalling his own past, a time when he'd believed the system could falter, that people like Celeste could be the wind to sweep away its shadows. Celeste stepped out of the courtroom, her heels clicking one last time on the marble as she pushed through the heavy glass doors. The midday sun blazed down, highlighting her tanned skin, its warmth threading through her hair like a faint halo. She breathed deeply, the fresh air flooding her lungs, washing away the weight of the past hours. Sparrows chirped in the trees outside, cars hummed faintly on Beta's streets, and the scent of fresh-cut grass from a nearby park blended into a symphony of life, a stark contrast to the stifling courtroom she'd left behind. She glanced back at the towering building, its white pillars rising like emblems of invincible authority. But to her, it wasn't untouchable. She'd proven that today not with force or fury, but with intellect, resolve, and the faith her family had instilled across generations. She thought of her father, who'd taught her the law was a tool shaped by its wielder. Her mother, who'd shown her that changing the system sometimes meant facing it head-on, no matter the cost. Her grandmother, who'd marched through water and blood to claim the right to exist as a human. Celeste climbed into her car, the engine rumbling to life like a greeting from an old friend. Jazz flowed from the radio, soft but vibrant, a reminder that her fight wasn't just for her. She smiled a small, steady curve and looked ahead through the windshield. This wasn't the end. The system lingered, with its shadows, its Hales and Rows, its biases woven into Beta City's fabric. But she wouldn't stop. She'd keep fighting for the workers her father defended, the communities her mother led, and the generations who'd see her as proof that justice wasn't handed down, but won through sweat, wit, and courage. The car rolled onto the asphalt, the courthouse shrinking in her mirror. This was just the beginning.